Right, good afternoon, everyone. Okay, it does sound like my mic's working, that's good. I'm really not that scary if you guys do want to come a little closer to the front. What we're going to do is I'm going to run through, as the name suggests, some of the things that I learned at my time in Silicon Valley. I was out there for about 18 months studying at Stanford University. But what I really want to do is get a sort of conversation going, really get it, as we've got a nice small group, I'm sure we can get a nice discussion going. I've been under strict instructions. If you want to speak, we have to give you a microphone because there are cameras and whatnot. So if you can just sort of wait for the mic before you do chip in. What I'll do is sort of kick off with a little introduction as to who I am, why I'm here talking to you today, and then I'm going to run through sort of 5 main points and 5 main sort of takeaways that I think we can all learn from Silicon Valley. So who am I? I'm the founder of Gojimo. Gojimo is a mobile app that helps students study for their exams. So we actually work on secondary school examinations, helping students predominantly in the UK at the moment to pass their exams, helping them get into university and so on. So we've got about 50,000 quiz questions like this, detailed explanations, thumbnails, and so on. This was something I actually started in my last year of school, but it fundamentally changed. The business fundamentally changed during my time out in California, out at Stanford, and that's kind of what I'll be focusing on today. How do we make money as a business? Well, we don't really try to make any money right now. We're one of those sort of freemium models, and we've started with the free bit, but we do work with partners like Oxford University Press and McGraw-Hill to sell their content. And certainly if we've got time at the end, I'm happy to do sort of more general Q&A, and we can talk about stuff like this. We can talk about ed tech. We can also talk about the size of the market, which is often overlooked. Test prep and tutoring, the market we're in, is worth $100 billion globally. Not many people know this. It's sort of something that investors tend to avoid at the moment, but edtech is increasingly becoming an interesting sector. And as a result, we have got some really interesting investors, and again, happy to talk about this at the end in the sort of general Q&A as well. So Index Ventures, who are a sort of Silicon Valley and a European fund, led our main seed round. They've invested in companies like Facebook and Skype and LoveFilm. And we've also got money from the Jam Jar Investments Group, and they are the Innocent Smoothie founders, if you guys know the British Innocent Smoothies. They're one of our other investors as well. So, Stanford. So I took a gap year, and this is when I sort of set up this business formally. And at the end of my gap year, found myself in the very fortunate position of having to choose between Cambridge, sorry to you Oxford students, Cambridge and Stanford. And for me, it was a really easy choice. Partly because in my application to Stanford, my business and everything I was doing had been put front and center. It was kind of my key selling point. Whereas in Cambridge, actually, my teachers and the people sort of helping me sort of prepare for interviews had said, don't even mention your business. The dons will be put off. They're so focused on academics, they don't want to hear about anything entrepreneurial. So for me, it was really clear that I wanted to go somewhere where there was this value placed on entrepreneurship, and somewhere where there's an ecosystem that can support that kind of activity. And as I said before, spending time at Stanford, and I was only there for 18 months, I ended up leaving, fundamentally changed the way I approached our business and the way I think about startups and companies. And those are sort of the 5 key learnings I took away and what I want to share with you today. So prior to Stanford, the company I was running was very similar. We were in the mobile learning space, but we were really just it was more I would describe as a lifestyle business. We were working with some of the sort of key publishers. We were working with Pearson, Oxford University Press here, McGraw-Hill in the States. But all we were doing was really work for hire. We were building projects for them. We were basically a development agency. At the time I left Stanford, we were very much thinking about how can we build our own platform, our own brand? How can we make that scalable? How do we take it international? And it was a very, very different way of approaching business and a very different ambition to have as a founder than what I went into the university with. So, to give you my first takeaway, I think one thing that the Valley does really, really well, and which I don't see as much of in other sort of technology and entrepreneurial ecosystems, is building communities. What do I mean by that? Well, one of the crucial things about Silicon Valley and what makes it so successful is that you have people who are giving back and sharing knowledge. You've got investors and you've got founders who have been extremely successful, but who still spend the time meeting with other founders and sort of sharing that knowledge and advising them and mentoring them. Successful entrepreneurs reinvest, they advise, they mentor, they share, and they continue to build. They're not solely motivated by money. I think one of the other really interesting things, has anyone spent much time in the Bay Area or Silicon Valley? No? Anyone visited? Yeah, okay, cool. So one thing you notice if you start taking meetings out there and talking to people is that like they're very, very willing to introduce you to their contacts. They're very willing to introduce you to people they think might be helpful. And I kind of say if you had a meeting in the Valley and you don't come out with at least 2 new contacts, it's a bit of a failure because people there are so willing to share. And that's very different from other industries and other sectors where you have less of this sharing and less of this mentality of introductions and trying to help one another. To put it in some context, Stanford, 1 in 3, 32% of the alumni found, invest, or join the boards of startup companies. So you've got a large portion of the student base there already interested or at least exposed to technology. It's very much a revolving door with the Valley. And if you look at the companies who've come out of it, obviously very recognizable names, these have all been started by founders from Stanford. And the beauty of being in an institution like that, which is right in the heart and center of Silicon Valley where all these companies are based, is that you get exposed to their founders, you get exposed to their teams. We would visit Google as part of our trip, and then your professor would know Larry Page, who would stop by and have a chat with you. Peter Thiel, the co-founder of PayPal, came and taught an entire course when I was there. Reid Hoffman, the founder of LinkedIn, and Evan Spiegel, the founder of Snapchat, came and sort of did chats in the weekly entrepreneurial seminar. So this is something you're exposed to on an almost daily basis, being a student there. And that's the sort of thing, I think probably here at Saïd, you get a bit more of, but certainly as an undergraduate at Oxford, and certainly as an undergraduate at most other UK universities, I wouldn't have had that experience. And I think that makes this place really, really unique. And it also creates a community at Stanford that is much more sort of knowledgeable and aware of this sector and of technology and of startups. And so I think there are 2 ways of thinking about building communities. The first is sort of at a micro level. So this is our team. And if you think about community, the first thing you can think about is the people you surround yourself with on a daily basis. And if you're doing a startup, that would be the other people who you're working with. I think the really interesting thing about some of the most successful companies over in the Valley is that they have built community-driven teams. Google continues to innovate, and largely I think it's down to the fact that they empower their employees to share ideas and to explore ideas, no matter how crazy they might be. And I think a lot of us could learn a lot from that. And it also enables those companies, kind of like I mentioned Google, to remain innovative even when they're large. I think Google's now 50,000 employees. But you can also think of this at a macro level. So this is a map of East London, which is very much now a sort of startup and technology hub. And it shows you how all the different startups are connected to one another. I think this is like mentions on Twitter. So not only are they geographically based close to one another, but they're actually communicating with one another and talking about each other. And that's a really interesting concept. And this is partly, a positive feedback cycle. If you're in technology and you're interested in startups, you might naturally place yourself in a position that is in close proximity to other people doing similar things. But if you think about the reasoning for that, it tends to be because we as founders, or we as early stage employees, or however you categorize yourself, are interested in everything else that's going on and can learn and benefit from being around those other people. So this is kind of our first opportunity for a chat, talking about communities. I don't know if anyone wants to jump in and has any insights into this or has any experience to share. Any managers in the room who have looked at how to inspire community in their team? Anyone have anything they want to say? Yes.
Just have a question about the previous slide. Just have a question about the previous slide. You had a lot of purple lines going to the bottom right. Are they going to the South Bank or to other parts of Europe? Or
yeah, I looked at that earlier. It's down to more, I think it's down towards Canary Wharf and south of the river, where you're seeing some interesting stuff in fintech taking place. And one thing you do notice more and more is these clusters around specific sectors. Certainly where we are, actually, there are a bunch of education technology firms. In Canary Wharf, there are a lot of financial technology firms. Outside of Cambridge, there's a lot of life sciences firms and so on. It's just that very natural clustering that takes place.
Thanks.
Anyone else? No? Well, okay, let me pose a question, because you guys are all far more qualified than I am, given I dropped out of university. So I'm very interested to get your insights on all these things. I think we've got quite an international crowd, so how about we start with which other countries or communities or cities do you guys see doing interesting things in terms of trying to build at this sort of macro level tech hubs or innovation hubs or entrepreneurial areas. I know someone's got something interesting to say.
We have a former MBA out in Nairobi who's talking about this
Right.
great tech startup scene there. I don't know much about it myself.
Yeah, there's stuff in Nigeria as well, and South Africa and Cape Town. There's a lot of interesting things happening. Should we get 2 mics going so we can share these around?
Hi. In the recent Tech City report, Bournemouth
Turn it on.
got a lot of recognition for being one of the fastest growing digital areas in the UK. I'm actually in Southampton, and it's totally different. We're not really competing with Bournemouth whatsoever.
Was there any insight into why Bournemouth was doing so well, or if you flip that around, looking at Southampton, what could be done better, or what sort of support could be there to, help you guys?
Bournemouth's a nice place to live. It's obviously on the coast, and I think they were finding there was a lot of people moving out of London and kind of relocating to the south coast, and for lifestyle reasons. And so Bournemouth's done quite well. There's been a network effect, I guess, since that sort of happened over the last 10 years.
I think one of the reasons we've seen so much that's happened in London is largely because of government support, which I think proves it can be a sort of top-down approach. And so, I was involved in a trade mission that went to the US, and there were 20 founders, and we were all from London. It was supported by Boris, and we had his press release and his press guys behind it, and they were helping us set up meetings. But what was really interesting was to spend a week with 20 other founders who were all from a very similar area and all at very similar stages in businesses. You can learn a huge amount by surrounding yourself with people. And that's, I think, that's partly why incubators and accelerators, why that model is so crucial in terms of bringing people together and bringing them into the same space, which is kind of, I think, one thing Saïd's trying to do here with the, the Launchpad, which is quite interesting. Anyone else want anything to add on communities and where they've seen interesting things taking place?
Hi. I cannot say that it's very tech-related, but prior to coming to MBA, I was in Mongolia and I was building an amusement park. So it was the brand new amusement park, and what we had to do was create these shows and events, programs, but we didn't have any of this human capital to showcase very nice things, right? So what we did was we took this approach of being an incubator for all these small interest communities. There are some group of people who are interested in maybe Japanese mangas or animes, and then we would invite them and say, hey, guys, why don't you showcase your talents here? So at the end of the season, we had 35 community interest groups throughout the summer showcase their talents. It was actually a pretty good mix of programs and events that enriched our experience.
That's the sort of insight I was hoping for. So thank you for the international experience. One thing I was going to throw at you guys was, we mentioned Google, which has over 50,000 employees now, and I've worked with them in the sense that, we're on Google Play and they promote our app occasionally and so on. Another company we work with is Pearson, who have got fewer employees at 40,000, but are still a big company, but are by no means anywhere near as sort of dynamic and as innovative as a company like Google. What do you think it is about Google in terms of their internal community and in terms of their team that enables them to continue to innovate, to continue almost to behave like a startup? Anyone have any thoughts on that? It's not a trick question. It could be anything.
Culture. I'd say maybe culture comes to play in this current instance, because I guess that they're told to spend, 20% of the time working on what they like to do, and 80% of the time doing what they should do. Right. So, it's kind of ingrained that they're meant to be trying to find ways to innovate and find novel ways to do things.
Yeah, I think that's one of the coolest things about Google is this 20% time that they have. So they get to spend one day a week just sort of pursuing any idea they have, and they can recruit their colleagues to work on it if they want to. but it's an incredible way as a engineer or as an employee to sort of work on something you're interested in. And as a manager, it's an incredible way to actually empower your team to pursue ideas that they might have. So let's move on to point 2. I feel like I've sucked all the energy out of you guys. Point 2, I mean, and this is fairly obvious if you think of Silicon Valley and if you think of Americans in general, there tends to be this sort of confidence and positivity that they give off. And I think one of the biggest differences between entrepreneurs and founders in the Valley and elsewhere in the world is that they exude confidence. When I used to come back to England, I used to come back quite regularly because I was running a little business here. I honestly used to feel depressed. And it's partly because of the weather. Without a doubt, the weather makes a difference. But it's partly because there is a sense of negativity, particularly I think around ideas. So there's this sense if you start to just if you bring up an interesting idea with a group of friends or your network or whoever, there is a sense that it can't be done, and people point out the difficulties as opposed to the possibilities. And that used to really, really bother me when I was sort of going backwards and forwards. I think one of the interesting things about that is that it prevents British entrepreneurs often from pursuing ideas that they might have. And I do a lot of talking to younger generations, and I go into schools quite a bit. And the really interesting thing there is all these kids have like amazing ideas, and they have brilliant ideas, and they're full of them, but they never ever would consider pursuing them as a business opportunity or even creating their own business. They see entrepreneurship and founding a company as something that can only be done by professionals, can only be done when you're older, is perhaps risky, is in some cases looked down upon. There's this fear of failure, which I think we're going to hopefully talk about later. And so there's all this negativity that surrounds the premise of a company, which is an idea. And that I find very difficult to deal with here in the UK. What have I got after this? And one really interesting way of sort of pointing this out, and one really interesting key change you guys can make if any of you, I don't know, anyone actually running their own business or interested in starting a company? Couple, cool. One thing I picked up on myself doing was talking about the goals of our business with a conditional sense. So like, Gojimo hopes to be the #1 exam preparation app in the world, or aims to be. Whereas if you talk to a Silicon Valley entrepreneur, they say our company will be X. It's very much a statement, it's fact. And these are very little things you can change, whether it's in the way you're talking about your idea or in your business, or even just in your business plan and when you're communicating something to investors. That can make a huge difference and will change the way other people perceive you. So anyone have anything they want to point out on this? I mean, this is probably a limited point, but if anyone has any examples they want to give or share, or any insight they can think of as to why there's such a big difference between the positivity that sits in the Valley and sort of what we see elsewhere.
Hi, my name is Parag. So in Silicon Valley as well, when people share ideas, they would discuss it with people who have been successful, and then they would tell them that in your idea something is lacking there, or if you discuss openly that this is what you might go wrong. So it's again a feedback that goes as kind of discouraging, is it? Mm-hmm. So like you'll still have that feedback from people around you. So like how would you handle being positive and confident? That's it.
I think one of the advantages, though, is the people that you can get that feedback from are people who are experienced and have perhaps done it before. And obviously that's something which we lack in more immature ecosystems, such as London, Oxford, Cambridge. One of the things that comes with that is the visibility of success. In Europe, we've had very few sort of billion-dollar tech businesses emerge, and we're seeing more and more these days. But there aren't as many, stories or well-known successes that we can point to and say, yes, it can be done, look at that. I mean, so you take Facebook on the day of its IPO, created 1,000 millionaires, right? So, incredible value, incredible success story for all the employees, incredible successes for the founders. And it's a very easy to look at that and say, oh, look, you can build a really successful business in this space. And sometimes I think we lack ambition and confidence because we haven't necessarily seen it done before. One of the biggest things we can do is bring speakers and events like this and bring over people who can help us see that it is possible.
I think also it makes a difference on the culture side because in the US people they're starting a business and they fail, it counts as experience.
Yeah.
So they got their lessons, they learn the lessons, and they move on. Here, if they start a business and they fail, that's something they're ashamed of.
Right.
So they're more positive and confident in an environment that is appreciating the experience rather than looking down on them.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, and it's something I want to talk about in a little bit as well. Is how we view risk and associated that with failure, because, as you say, there it's viewed as a sort of educational experience, and the first thing an investor will ask you if they find out your last company failed is, well, what did you learn from that, and what's going to be different about this new one? And I think certainly my experience in Europe and what I've seen here is it can be very, very different, and failure is very much a negative thing. I think that's starting to change, at least in the London tech scene. So, sort of related to confidence and positivity is this idea of ambition and big thinking. And this is an area where I think it's very clear to look at the Valley and say, okay, well, they set their goals significantly higher than we ever would. And to put this, sort of to prove this, $2.7 trillion. This is the sort of the annual revenue of companies founded at Stanford, which is higher than the GDP of the UK, higher than the GDP of France. And so, these companies are absolutely massive, and they're creating a huge amount of value on an annual basis. If you compare that to, I don't know if any of you guys were in the sort of the opening remarks yesterday, where they talked about the amount of the amount of revenue Oxford was receiving from sort of alumni and startups that have been created here. I think the university gets back $7 million a year. I think that's what was said. This obviously not going straight back to Stanford, but Stanford's getting significantly more than that. You're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars a year off the basis of the patents that they're licensing out and so on. So I just think that the ambition over there is much greater than what we have here. One way to sum this up really nicely, if you guys have seen The Social Network, this is one of my favorite quotes, and I think it kind of sums up that mentality quite a bit. $1 million isn't cool. You know what's cool? $1 billion. But it's important not to just look at this from a sort of monetary aspect, but also from a sort of impact aspect. When you talk to a founder in the UK, typically they'll say something along the lines of, we're aiming to be the biggest brand in the UK that does X. Their ambition tends not to exceed the United Kingdom. Perhaps they'll say in Europe. You talk to a Silicon Valley entrepreneur and a founder out there, and they'll say, yeah, we're building a global business that's going to be worth $1 billion that's solving this massive issue. And they really, really hype it up, and they have this vision of building a global brand. They have this vision of solving some huge problem. And I think actually one of the key things is that they associate what they're doing with problems and with issues. And I think that's a really important thing to do as a founder, because it enables you to build sort of a following, build a team, focus your company around the issue that you're trying to solve. And that's something that we also don't do enough of. So this, I think, is a really good discussion point, because I think there's so much to be said here, and there are so many examples. Does anyone want to just throw in some thoughts? Or, one of the examples I had when I was just thinking through this is Elon Musk. If Elon Musk had come over to the UK and said, I'm going to start a private space company here, any of you think that would be possible? Everyone's shaking their head. Anyone want to give some thoughts as to why that's not possible? Right. So he would probably more likely to be ridiculed than he would be supported. And in fact, I find this a little bit when I talk to investors, even the venture capitalists who want to hear it. We say oh yeah, we're trying to build a $1 billion brand. You almost have to chuckle when you say it to sort of increase your credibility. Whereas in the Valley, that's very much what they want to see, what they want to hear. That's all they care about is building those $1 billion companies. What else do you think sort of limits the ambition?
I think maybe that fear of failure.
Yeah,
that's
definitely.
It's kind of promoted. It's okay to fail hard and fast and often.
Right.
In the US, but in the UK, I guess, because there's not that transparency with what's gone well, what's not gone well, maybe that's limiting people's thinking and ambition. Yeah, and the issue with big ideas is you're likely to, the failure is meant to be even bigger. So that you're kind of limiting your exposure. The smaller your ambition. Anyone else have any thoughts on that?
What about how this relates? I mean, some of you guys are MBA students, so you can talk about this better than I can. When it comes to sort of management, how do you think this idea of ambition and thinking big can come and play a role in sort of the day-to-day management of a team and people?
I think you just, if you're an MBA or you have that background, you know how to, what boxes you need to tick on a day-to-day basis. So like cash flow, working cap, all those things are at the forefront of your mind to make sure that, you're operating like the business as it should, and everything else kind of, hopefully, you should have the right team around you. Yeah. And in terms, one of the things I was thinking about in terms of in terms of like motivating that team that you've got around you, one of the interesting, I don't know if any of you guys have read the Steve Jobs biography by, what's his name, Walter Isaacson. Yeah, thank you. Walter Isaacson. The really interesting thing he talks about is that reality distortion field. This idea that Steve Jobs as a founder and as a manager set ambitions so high that most people sort of deemed it unachievable, but then the teams would always manage to achieve it anyway. Essentially, he was thinking big on a sort of product basis every single time and ensuring that his team would always hit his vision, despite the fact many of them didn't necessarily believe they could themselves. So I think this can come to play in both a sort of macro level, but also in just day-to-day management of a team. I think being ambitious is good. So let's move on. Creating opportunities. So, if you look at Silicon Valley and what makes it successful, I think one of my 5 things is that they're very much about creating opportunities. Everyone's putting themselves in positions to succeed. What do I mean by that? Well, if you're an employee, right, the interesting thing, a bunch of my friends are now finally graduating from Stanford, they're all looking at their job options. And what's really interesting is that they tend to not care so much about the salary and the amount of money they can make on an annual basis, but they're looking more at the options package and the long-term value. And we said, Facebook created 1,000 millionaires when it IPO'd. But the reason those guys became millionaires was not because they just, they worked hard, right? It's because they put themselves in the opportunity where they had at least a chance of, exiting and exiting quite big. And so one of the things I think often people don't do, and this is the case particularly with sort of non-entrepreneurial types, is they don't put themselves in an opportunity to succeed. So, I'm here today. Why am I here today? Like, it doesn't necessarily directly benefit my business in any way. But at the same time, there's been some press here who I've talked to. One of you guys might be interested in what we're doing and want to come work with us. Some of you guys may end up one day working in venture capital. We may talk. There's no way of me knowing what value I can get out of attending and putting in the time to build this presentation. But by being here, I'm creating the opportunity for interesting things to happen. One example I have of this is, these are sort of small examples. So when we first raised a little bit of money in the very, very early days of the business, it was more of a friends and family round. I wrote the business plan, and then because we always used Twitter in this sort of mundane way back then, I tweeted, finished my business plan as, the exciting status update that it was. But I had this guy in Australia tweet back like, I'd love to read that. I had no idea who he was. I still have never met him in person to date. But, I sent him my business plan because there was nothing sort of top secret in there. And he ended up putting in over £10,000 in investment. If I hadn't bothered tweeting that, that opportunity would have never arisen. Likewise, when I was about, 17, we had a speaker come into my school. And he was, at the time, the CEO of a media company. Just a sort of well-known, semi-successful British businessman. And so I, being that sort of keen youngster that I was, went up to him afterwards and had a conversation with him, and then being even more sort of, keen, I went and added him on LinkedIn because I had my LinkedIn profile set up as a 17-year-old. 5 years later, he was appointed to be the CEO of McGraw-Hill Education, who happened to be one of our partners, happened to now be one of our biggest partners, and we obviously have now an excellent relationship with them because I happen to know the CEO. And it's only because I went and bothered talking to him and bothered to connect with him at that time when he really, couldn't necessarily help me in any way as a 17-year-old kid. It sort of paid off down the road because I created that opportunity. Those are some of my personal anecdotes on that. I think
Thomas Edison summed this up really well. This quote I really, really like because, to me it sort of dictates the difference between people who do create opportunities for themselves and those who don't. And it's largely that those who don't tend to see opportunities as work. Me coming here, as I said, it is work. I have to create a presentation and come up with semi-interesting things to tell you guys. I hope they're useful. But it created work. But at the same time, as I said, it's giving me an opportunity which hopefully might pay off. So I don't know if anyone wants to contribute any thoughts on this. I think it's quite a really interesting aspect of what can make people successful. Does anyone have anything they want to share or any thinkings on that matter? Otherwise, we can move on to the fifth and final point, which we'll do. So this has kind of come up in our brief discussions already, which is take risks. And I mean, this is talked about quite a lot, so I'm not going to sort of dwell on it too much, but I think it's intertwined with what we were saying earlier with failure and how we view failure. I think if you're in a society surrounded by people who view failure as being okay, potentially view failure as a form of education, then you will potentially take larger risks. And on the flip side, if people look down on failure, you're less likely to do so. So here in the UK, certainly, and definitely in parts of Europe, we definitely have a lower sort of appetite for risk because we tend to look down on failure quite a bit more. What I tend to do in terms of like my personal philosophy in terms of how I like analyze decisions and so on, is I always like to consider the worst case scenario. Because it turns out that the worst case scenario in any situation never seems quite as bad as it does on the surface. And so, for instance, when I left Stanford, so I dropped out after 18 months, most of my friends back here thought I was absolutely crazy. They were like, what on earth are you doing? What happens if your company fails? You have no degree to back, if there's a backup plan. But I pointed out to them, I was like, look, if it failed tomorrow, I have about 5 people I've worked with, if not more, who I could call and get a job within 24 hours. Because I've proven to them through my experience and what I'm already doing outside of university that I'm capable as an employee, as a worker. And so my view on that decision, certainly to me, it seemed a lot less risky than the way other people perceived it. And I think as a way of thinking about things, that can often help. So I'm not going to, as I said, I'm not going to talk about this one too much because I think it's something that's talked about a lot. But does anyone have anything they want to add to sort of talk about failure, talking about risks? Actually, since we've got such an international crowd, perhaps people can sort of share what the views on, and particularly on failure, is like where they're from, because I'm just interested in that international perspective. Any of you can answer that one, because you're all from interesting places. So hands up who's international. Okay, can we give the mic to any one of those lovely people?
So I come from India.
Right.
And again, as you said, we coming at communities, we have a lot of upcoming communities in Bangalore and Hyderabad, basically, where businesses, where like MBA schools are promoting incubation centers for their students to meet up with industry people and create businesses. So it's working well in these two cities, but it's just taking off. But then again, taking risks when it comes to that, we still have the communities from our personal lives, our families, friends, relatives. So when they look upon it and they see, okay, what's your plan B? And the focus mainly is not on the primary goal, but on like what happens if this doesn't work out. Like
Yeah, so it's a sort of negativity. Yeah.
So that still, I think, is a very, very big part in the whole plan.
Yeah.
So, like, okay, what happens if you don't do this? Like, you'll lose your job, you'll not use your graduation or your undergrad degree.
There's more of a focus on the potential failure than there is on the success.
Well, kind of, yes.
Yeah.
So it's again back to the first one. They still see like failure as something, okay, you failed now. So like chances of doing a second business after the first one fails is really, really low.
Right.
Because you tried it and it's not working.
Cool. Anyone else want to add anything from one more international perspective, perhaps? Come on. Pass the microphone, yeah.
It's the lazy option. Well, I'm from New Zealand, and we do take risk, possibly not as much as Silicon Valley, but more than A lot of people in a lot of countries do. I guess that's maybe a consequence of being at the corner of the world. But I think what we struggle with isn't the taking the risk, it's having a critical mass of people there to do it. There are a lot of people doing entrepreneurial things down there, but they're sort of just in New Zealand, and there's no Silicon Valley or Silicon Roundabout or anything like that at this stage. It wouldn't surprise me if there was soon, but not yet.
So what do you think is lacking? So it's like obviously human resource, venture capital, everything that comes with an ecosystem.
Well, most people that undertake entrepreneurial ventures in New Zealand will move to Silicon Valley.
Right.
Just because there is no, or virtually no venture capital at all, and there's no focal point. So there are people doing it, but they're spread all over the country. But I mean, there's only 4 million people there, so I guess the number of people that are doing it might be a higher proportion. Because there are stories a lot circulating of people doing things, but it's all very internal until somebody moves overseas to Silicon Valley or San Francisco.
Thank you guys. Sorry for putting you on the spot. So that is kind of the conclusion. There are the 5 again. So for me, these were the biggest things that I took away. Building communities, both in that sense of the people you're sort of surrounding yourself with on a daily basis, but also at a more macro level, where are you working geographically and so on. Being confident and thinking positively, I mean, that sounds so generic, but I think it's so important. I think one of the interesting things that kind of summed that up for me was my CTO once said to me, and I've remembered this ever since, he said, the productivity of our team is dictated by your mood in the morning. So if you can be a positive leader and a positive founder and so on, that can make a huge difference, both to your team and the success of the business. Being ambitious and thinking big, you're never going to build $1 billion business unless you try to. Create opportunities, put yourselves in the position where you can get success, put yourself in a position where you can create opportunity. You never know where that's going to come from, but put in a little bit of work and therefore you might get a nice outcome. And of course, take risks. I think the more we can view failure as an education, that's more of a cultural thing. We can't just sort of say it and it will happen. But if we can view risk and the downside as a way of learning and a way of building experience, that can really benefit everyone. So that was all I had on lessons from the Valley. I'm very happy if people have more general Q&A stuff they want to do on venture capital or fundraising or working in London or the ed tech scene or anything like that. Otherwise, we can sort of end slightly early and go get more tea, which I would also be very happy with.
So I have a question for students graduating from Stanford.
Yeah.
So how do students who enter entrepreneurship from Stanford, they manage their student debt?
They manage their what?
Student
their debt.
Loans.
Yeah, I think that's a tough one. How do they manage their student debt? I don't actually know. I'd have to go ask them. But I think, the thing about working in the Valley is if you've got a good idea, you tend to be able to get funding pretty quickly, and that means that you can also take a salary pretty quickly, and so you can start to pay off that debt just as you would if you were working at Google or what have you. I think obviously one of the benefits, and we all know this, is that in the Valley, if you're starting a tech startup, the proximity and the access to capital is much higher, and so you can get seed capital and afford to take a small salary quite early on. Whereas I couldn't afford to take a salary until year 4 of the business after we'd raised VC money over here. So prior to that, would have had no way of paying off my debts or what have you.
So it's more to do with the turnaround time. Like if you get money, you get it really quickly, or if you don't, then.
Yeah, it depends, doesn't it? There are people who have to really fight for particular investment stuff, especially if it's an idea that's so out there and wacky that they can't find anyone to support it. But if you just look at the numbers and you just look at the amount of capital over there and the number of VCs and investments and the number of successful people who are now doing angel investments, it's so much higher. And even with the huge number of startups, I believe it's relatively proportionally still higher, that you've got a greater chance of getting funding in the first place. Especially now that you've got these shifts to sort of crowdfunding and opportunities like Kickstarter. It's never really been easier to raise money around an idea than historically it has been. So, if you work on an idea for a long period of time and you fail to raise capital around it, I think a lot of people would start to question whether it's worthwhile if they're out there, and perhaps move on to other stuff. But it depends how passionate you are about what you're doing.
Going back to your point about building communities.
Yeah.
What do you think are the key ingredients to build a community?
Right, in a sort of small level with like your own team, or in a larger sort of ecosystem?
In an ecosystem level, like we are trying to do that here in Oxford.
Yeah.
But what do you think are the ingredients for building a successful community?
Well, I think one key ingredient which you guys do have is a fantastic university. I mean, if you look at the origins of Silicon Valley, it largely sort of spun out originally from Stanford. Probably one of the very earliest companies was Hewlett-Packard. They had 2 Stanford alums who were encouraged by the provost there to actually start a business. And so Stanford and Silicon Valley have been very much intertwined from day one. And we kind of, certainly one of the things I think we lack slightly in London is a direct relationship with a top university. I mean, we've got them surrounding us, but certainly it's not like, startups are going and working with Imperial on a daily basis. Whereas that's the sort of thing that happens, every single day at Stanford. So there's that. I think to sort of kickstart all these things, government support can really help. And that's one thing that the British government has done really well. Be it sort of just general support in R&D grants, or things like trade missions like I did to the US, but also particularly in sort of tax breaks for early stage investors. So EIS, which is the Entrepreneurial Investment Scheme, I can't remember what it is, but gives high net worth a massive tax break when they invest in sort of startup style risky businesses. And certainly it's largely thanks to that scheme that we've now got a fairly decent angel group in London and elsewhere in the UK. So I think that's all important. And then I think beyond that, it's just very basic things like getting capital in there, and that just sort of organically happens with time, and infrastructure. If we didn't have good Wi-Fi or high-speed broadband, we would struggle to make great internet-based products. So it's a combination of all that.
I mean, you talked a lot about Stanford. So how much of these lessons that you were talking about would you now take back to London? I mean, before you gave one example in Stanford, you would not talk about millions but billions.
Yeah.
Would you start saying, so put yourself in a situation of someone who raises a business now in the UK? Would you recommend him to say, my target is to have 5 billion within 5 years? So something like this. I mean, you've got to be. So how much of these lessons can you really?
I mean, I genuinely think they all apply, and I look at the way I was operating what was a very small business at the time, and it all fundamentally changed off the back of these sort of things that I was just picking up because I was so exposed to them at Stanford. So something like, talking about a business being worth hundreds of millions versus billions. It depends what type of investor you're talking to, but if you're talking to a venture capital firm, and like the one we raised from the London office, but they do a lot of stuff in Silicon Valley, so that they're familiar with that philosophy. They're not interested in investing in companies that are only worth hundreds of millions. They're only looking for billion-dollar businesses. And so if you don't think that way, and if you can't communicate that way, they're not going to back you. I had breakfast with a VC from another firm a couple of weeks ago, and on that day they had an exit. Well, one of their portfolios exit for I think 400 million or some big number. And he said, yeah, it was great. We get some of that capital back now and stuff, but actually that's a failure for us. We need billion-dollar exits. And so if you're going after that top capital and going to VC firms, you need to be pitching an idea that is a billion-dollar idea. If you have something that's smaller and could still be worth hundreds of millions, they're not going to back it, but you can get that funding from elsewhere. So I do think that's applicable. I think the ambition, with time, as we begin to support more risky things, that can happen. I think the confidence is key to being like a good leader, a good founder, to gaining money. Confidence attracts people, to gain investors, to gain talent. Being a confident founder really, really helps. So I think most of that is applicable to startups over here.
Yeah, but not here.
No, definitely in the UK, yeah. I mean, all 5 of those are things I try to do here in the UK. And that's how I present myself to investors, as a confident, ambitious. We talk about trying to build a global exam preparation brand. We want to build a billion-dollar business. We don't talk about exiting in a couple of years for a few hundred million. That's not our goal. And so far for us, that's worked, and that's because they buy into that vision.
you comment a little bit on your own fundraising experience and how was that? Last time? I mean, I guess you raised your funds here, and how do you contrast that? Maybe if you have raised it in Silicon Valley, for instance.
Fundraising is an absolute pain. I mean, if you guys have ever done it before, it's just a painful experience. It's like a full-time job, and you're still trying to run a business in the evenings. So I've sort of raised just under £1 million in total to date. One was through a sort of friends and family round, but also included a couple of acquaintances, such as the Australian Twitter guy. That was many years back. The more sort of serious fundraising was at the end of 2013, when we took money from Index and the Innocent founders and so on. And that for me was a really interesting process. I'd never done it before. I went in as a very naive sort of 21-year-old or 20-year-old, had no idea what I was doing, went in and I think originally asked for like £1.5 million, sort of got laughed at, and then they turned around and said, well, we'll give you 750, that's probably all you need for now. So I think one thing, it helps to be young and it helps to be naive because people will just kind of help you out along the way. Certainly if I'd gone in there, age 35, having run a couple other businesses, they would have laughed me out of the room if I'd asked for that much money when we really didn't have much to offer at the time. But I mean, were there specifics around how to fundraise I think one thing in the UK that people often get wrong is the type of investors they go to. And that kind of comes back to what we were just saying about, are you building $1 billion company? Is that your vision? Or are you going for something that is a lifestyle business? Or are you building something where you want to exit for tens of millions or hundreds of millions in the medium term? Depending on what you're looking for, you're going to need a different type of investor. And one of the things I see quite a lot is founders coming to me and saying, oh, can you introduce me to Index? Or can you introduce me to one of the other VCs when it's not at all applicable to the type of business they have. I mean, if you're running, something that's probably ever going to be UK-centric, such as a food company or a drinks company, whatever, you're very unlikely to get a VC funding that because they're looking at things that can go international, are really scalable, and have $1 billion opportunity. And so I think there's a misunderstanding with some founders as to when VCs would be the right investor.
So how do you see Gojimo in the next 5 years? What's your vision?
Right, we're trying to be $1 billion international business. So what we've been working on Gojimo now really for about 18 months, or maybe even 2 years, and we really sort of struggled to get it going in the first place. So it took us about a year to get the product right. We went through 3 different iterations. We weren't really getting growth in the first year, and then finally on the 3rd iteration, we started to see all this organic growth, and it really started to go viral. And so now we reach about 15% of sort of British GCSE takers, which is the biggest exam. We've got about 300,000 monthly active users. So we're pretty comfortable with where we've got to in the UK market. We're happy, and we think we found the model that works in terms of acquiring users and marketing to them and then keeping them. Clearly the product is something that appeals to them because they're using it. So now for us, the next few years are about, okay, well, how do we take that international? And so that begins purely because it's easiest with mostly English-speaking markets. So we've now done a sort of soft launch in the US and in South Africa for a whole bunch of reasons. And it's really about sort of taking the model that we've built here and trying to replicate that there. And if we can do it in those 2 countries, which are very, very different, and show that it also can work elsewhere, then we can start to grow even faster and do that in a bunch of different areas. So it's really about trying to replicate a single model and then apply that to other markets, because then that's something that's scalable and that's something that VCs will back. So that's kind of where we are at the moment.
So they say that if you're looking for money, investors look at the team, right? At the entrepreneur, who's the guy. And then it's even better if the entrepreneur has been a serial entrepreneur who's done lots of things before. But if you're not a serial entrepreneur, if you want to get into the scene, how do you get money? How do you persuade the investor when, for example, the idea you are pitching is totally irrelevant to your background?
Right.
How do you start this?
So, that's kind of the position I was in. So, I was 20 years old. I'd left university. I was pursuing. I'm not a developer, and I was building mobile apps with a team. I didn't at the time have a CTO, so I didn't really have a senior team around me. So really it was just me. And you know, as you said, the one thing that investors look at above anything else is the team. And so I think I was able to convince them that I, as an individual, was sort of trustworthy and, you know, hopefully going to make a good founder, hopefully going to make a good CEO in the long term. And so they bought into that. And then second to that was, well, okay, what's the product? And you know, we had, although we went out raising money around the Gojimo idea, we'd been doing stuff like this for some years. So I was able to say, look, we've been operating in the mobile learning space. We've built apps for Pearson, for McGraw-Hill, for Oxford University Press. We've got a network. So we had some things going for us already. And that was stuff that, you know, I had just sort of managed while at university. And that helped sort of verify what we were doing. And then the third thing was, you know, we were going after a big market. There's that $1 billion opportunity. And so, you know, hopefully a good person who can find a good team to work with him, something they've had a bit of experience in, they've got a network there, you know, they've got some early numbers, not really related to this, but in a similar space to show that it could take off, and then potentially, you know, big opportunity given the market size we saw earlier. Anyone else, or should we end it there? Oh, yeah, okay.
I mean, at some point you were looking for people who were more senior in your certain roles, things that you probably were not very familiar with. Yeah. So building this team and a more senior team, how did you approach this? How did you start finding people who, I don't know, do things that you don't know about?
Right. So, I mean, the most obvious one for me was like technical. You know, I'm not a developer. How can I interview and hire developers? So for me, and also being a sole founder and not having a co-founder by my side, I've always tried to surround myself with a good network of advisors. And that can be very informal, from, you know what you're talking about, let me buy you lunch once a quarter, to, you know, people who have options and have advised us for a number of years. And so when it came to some of those initial interviews and some of this screening process, I would get them involved, and, you know, a bunch of them, for instance, were technical. This is when the investors had decided to commit. They were also able to help, and they put me in touch with some of the CTOs from their other portfolio companies. So between those sort of two groups of people, I had a network who could help me screen, interview, and so on. You know, also teach me what to look for. So I can at least initially look at a CV and make sure I not send it to a reputable, hardworking CTO and waste their time when actually it's not at all suitable. So you sort of learn it on the go, but you also get people who know what they're talking about to help you. Cool. All right, I think we'll leave it there then. That was just under an hour, so you guys can get a cup of tea before your next session. Thank you very much for coming along. I hope it was interesting.